The war in Ukraine is a kind of wake-up moment, soul-searching moment for just about every country around the world, whether it's China or the United States or Britain or Poland or the Baltic republics, but also, and maybe especially Germany, because this is for Germany the moment that Germany has to step out of the shadow of its own history, of starting World War II under Adolf Hitler, and say we are a responsible, militarily responsible partner on the European stage, and we will take on Russia militarily and politically in a way that we've never done so before. They've been traveling for days, if not weeks, leaving their homes behind. And this is just the start of their odyssey. They have no idea what the future holds for them. Zeitenwende.
Zeitenwende.
It means basically, literally translated, means time change. But it's a kind of one of those sort of hefty, weighty, composite German nouns. And you use it to indicate a major milestone in history, which is indeed what this war was. Literally until about a week before the war, Germany wasn't even prepared to consider some of the more important economic sacrifices, like the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the new pipeline that was agreed with the previous German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, started to be planned almost immediately afterwards. He, a predecessor of Olaf Scholz of the same party, became the lead lobbyist on the Nord Stream 2 project. And this pipeline that went directly from Russia to Germany was bypassing the Baltic republics and bypassing Ukraine, obviously, was going to be one of the main sources of energy for Germany. And he had come under pressure, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, to scrap this project almost as soon as he took office. It was first brought up by one Donald Trump, by the way, at the NATO summit in Brussels, where he said, you've got to scrap Nord Stream 2. Angela Merkel, what are you doing, buying all that gas from the Russians? And at the time, everyone thought that Trump was a lunatic for even mentioning it. And he was right. Scholz had already kind of approached the altar of economic sacrifice by saying, before the war even started, we're going to scrap this project. That was a difficult decision for him to make. The next thing he did, once the invasion was out there and it was obvious and the world was in shock, is that he stood up in the Bundestag on a Sunday. And that's when he had his Zeitenwende moment. He basically said, we, the Germans, are going to have to rearm. And we're going to have to step up to the plate in the way that the Americans have always wanted us to, but we're going to do more than that. We're going to actually spend more than the percentage required by NATO on armaments. We're going to spend 2.5% as opposed to 2%. We're going to spend that money.
This is a major challenge for the entire country. It means to have a modern, progressive German armed forces, Bundeswehr, that can protect us. In the Munich Security Conference a week ago, I said we need aircraft, we need ships, and we need soldiers who are well equipped, ideally equipped for their missions. That's what it's about. The 2022 German budget will have 100 billion euros earmarked for this as a one-off, and this money will be used for investment in the German armed forces.
And the idea that you can have the headline, Germany rearms, Europe relieved, shows you how much the world has changed. Because Germany's European partners, including the Poles, who've had a very difficult history with Germany, always wanted the Germans to do more on defense. And now the Germans have done that. But that's the easy part. That speech was the easy bit. Actually implementing not just the spending, but then sending the right weapons to Ukraine at the right time of the war has been politically very contentious, has strained the ruling coalition, has brought out some real surprises, including, perhaps most prominently, that the Green Party, which when it was first founded in 1980, put in its manifesto, in its founding manifesto, get rid of NATO, get rid of the German Bundeswehr, the German army, no more weapons anywhere. Germany has to be a completely pacifist nation. The Greens are now the most strident members of the coalition when it comes to armaments for Ukraine. It's not an easy thing to say for a German chancellor, because the weight of history of the Second World War, of Nazi Germany, of Hitler's invasion of the rest of Europe, still weighs heavily on, it's part of, the political DNA of any German politician. And particularly complex inside the Social Democrat Party of Olaf Scholz. So not an easy thing to say, but he said it and he was roundly applauded. The implementation of it is, though, quite tricky. And you can measure the military commitment of European Western countries to Ukraine by the range of missiles and weaponry that they sent. the longer range the stuff you send, and at the moment, there are not many people sending the really long range stuff that could hit Russia from inside Ukraine, the more you believe that the biggest crisis here is not the defeat of Vladimir Putin that could make him do something irrational and radical like throwing nukes, but the biggest crisis of Ukraine is Russian imperialism, Russia behaving like Nazi Germany, taking over the whole of Europe. And essentially, the world at the moment, the geopolitical world, is divided into two camps. Those who fear the defeat of Putin and the victory of Ukraine, pushing Russia into that corner, and those who believe that if they don't defeat Vladimir Putin, he will push the rest of Europe into a corner where it doesn't want to be. And Britain, Poland, the Baltic republics are on one side of that debate. The British government's been quite clear, we need to defeat Vladimir Putin. Ukraine has to win. Whereas the Germans, the French, the Italians, and the Dutch are on the other side of that debate, saying Putin must not win. Ukraine must not lose. But you don't hear Olaf Scholz saying Ukraine must win. Those are different words. And then America is somewhere in the middle, because Joe Biden famously said, I will send them heavy weaponry, but I will not send them the stuff that can hit Russia from inside Ukraine, because that would lead to a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. Now, the Russians believe they're already in that confrontation, but NATO does not. The First World War was something that, the great powers of Europe slithered into almost by mistake. And there's a wonderful quote from Kaiser Wilhelm II speaking to his cousin Tsar Nicholas II and King George V, saying, if Granny had been alive, none of this would have happened. And Granny was, of course, Queen Victoria. So you have the grandchildren of Queen Victoria, who are now running different empires in Europe, all falling out with each other because of a tectonic diplomatic arrangement whereby if the Serbian nationalists attack the Austro-Hungarians, then a system of coalitions will come into play whereby the whole of Europe will be at each other's throats. That is what they want to avoid. And I guess what he's saying is, we don't want to slither into a position, slide into an unwanted global conflict, a World War III, because of allegiances around Ukraine. That's what he's saying there. And of course, what happened at the end of World War I is that the whole monopoly board of European politics was thrown up in the air. The Tsar lost his job and then his head finally. There were revolutions all over Europe. And obviously that's what they're afraid of. It's not just World War III, we could all get annihilated by nukes, but also the political landscape that we all know, that we've all got used to, which has given us unprecedented peace and prosperity, if we don't handle this carefully, could be kicked up, upended, overturned, to create something which is unrecognizable and possibly, if history were to repeat itself, a lot nastier. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means literally past overcoming, past management. So there were lots of other words to do with that as well, but essentially denazification was, a lot of it was about Vergangenheitsbewältigung, how to overcome your past. Now, some people thought that meant denying your past or forgetting about it, ignoring it, and other people thought actually this meant talking about your past, doing lots of soul searching, not repeating the mistakes of the past. Now, the German-Russia relationship, and I know this from my own family, is a very specific and very complex one that touches all sorts of historical neurological points. My parents were both refugees at the end of the Second World War and were running away from the Russians, who were exacting in many cases some pretty brutal revenge on the people who had just killed 20 million of them. And they were running away from the Russians to get to the western sectors of occupation in Germany, which is either mainly the British or the American sectors. And they were doing so at the end of a war which their parents knew was deeply unjust, in which there was no sympathy for the Germans who'd lost that war, because they started it and they killed an awful lot of people in the process. The German attitude towards Russia, despite the violence of the history between these two countries, is defined by a complex of guilt, of collective guilt, about what the Nazis did to the Russians. And also a sense of geography, that we have to get on with the Russians, we Germans, because they're right next door. In between is a country called Poland, which actually for 130 years ceased to exist entirely. It was basically Germany rubbing up against the Russian Empire. The German Empire rubbing up against the Russian Empire, with Poland as a kind of buffer zone that disappeared. All those areas of Middle Europe are like a flat, you remember that game Risk? Anyway, it's imagine a flat board for Risk, where the borders can be changed. There are no natural boundaries. I mean, there are a couple of rivers, but there are no great mountain ranges. Identity in that part of Europe is defined by language, by history, by culture, but not necessarily by natural borders. We don't know that living on the island of Britain, because we are very lucky that we have these natural borders, but they don't have that. So things are constantly shifting. But again, getting back to that German-Russian relationship, and this is very much part of the DNA of the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. It is very much part of his party, the Social Democrat Party, that has always tried to find an accommodation with the Russians, partly because of historical guilt, partly because they're afraid of, Mother Russia, the Russian bear next door on that same flat landmass where the borders can shift, but also, of course, pragmatically, economically, because they need Russian energy for the German export economy to thrive. Post-Cold War, stability, prosperity, complacency, a feeling that, the Russians, they're a bit frothy, but we can handle them. That was very much Angela Merkel's thing, for which she's being criticized now. The post-Cold War absence of an immediate nuclear jeopardy, the German army became really terrible. I mean, it's a terrible army. They're terrible equipment, not enough equipment. One of the reasons why the Germans are slow in sending all these tanks that they've promised the Ukrainians is that they haven't got them.